The call came in just before noon. A small animal, rocky ground. Someone had spotted it from the road and called it in. The team grabbed their gear without much urgency. This kind of thing happened a few times a month out here. A lost cat, a young rabbit that had wandered too far, maybe an injured bird. Nobody hurried. The drive out took about 20 minutes. Dry hills on both sides. Wind moving through the scrub grass in slow, steady waves. The kind of afternoon that feels like nothing important is going to happen. And then they got out of the truck, and everything stopped being routine. The first thing one of the rescuers noticed was the sound. A thin, high cry. Weak. Almost like a bird call, but not quite. Coming from a flat patch of exposed ground between two large rocks. She held up a hand. Everyone slowed, and that's when they saw it. Lying in the dirt, half in shadow, was a small kitten. Tiny, maybe 3 or 4 weeks old at most. Its mouth was open, crying steadily into the dry air, and crouched directly over it, not beside it, not near it, but over it, with its body forming a low arch above the kitten's, was a Pallas's cat. Wild, dense fur the color of stone and dust, round, flat face, eyes that didn't blink, looking straight at them. Nobody moved, not the rescuers, not the Pallas's cat. A Pallas's cat, a manual, is not a social animal. It doesn't hold its ground when people approach. In every documented encounter, the instinct is the same: freeze, assess, vanish. They are shadows in the grass, ghosts of rocky hillsides. Seeing one at this distance, in open daylight, is almost unheard of, and yet here it was, close enough that they could see its breath, not running, not even shifting its weight. One of the rescuers took a slow step forward. The manual's ears pressed back, its pupils narrowed. A low sound rose in its throat, not a hiss, not quite a growl, something between the two, but it didn't move. The kitten cried again beneath it, and the manual, without looking away from the rescuers, pressed one paw, gently, across the kitten's back. Not hard, not rough, just present, like it was saying, "I'm still here." If you enjoy emotional wildlife stories like this one, consider subscribing, because what they discovered later, once they got close enough to really look, no one had any explanation for it. They tried again, slower this time, one person moving while the others stayed back. The manual tracked every movement. Its body stayed low and wide, knees bent, weight forward. A posture that said, "I will not be moved from here easily." But it wasn't aggressive. It wasn't preparing to attack. It was positioning itself, inserting its body between the approaching rescuer and the kitten. Over and over, as the angle shifted, the manual shifted too, blocking, deliberately. The lead rescuer knelt down, maybe 8 feet away, and just looked. The kitten was pale, very pale, almost white against the brown dirt. Its eyes were barely open. It was shivering in a way that had nothing to do with cold. The cry had gotten quieter in the last few minutes. It needed help. Anyone could see that. But so did everything else about this situation need explaining. That kitten was not a manual. Anyone who knew the species could see it immediately. Manual kittens are born with thick, dark-tipped fur, dense and patterned from their first weeks of life. This animal was something else entirely. Domestic, almost certainly. Thin, pale, the kind of kitten that belonged in a barn or a house, not out here, in open country, on dry, rocky ground miles from the nearest road. There was no logical reason for it to be here. There was no logical reason for the manual to be here either, but here they both were. The rescuer watched the manual rest its chin, very briefly, against the top of the kitten's head. The kitten went quiet for a moment, just for a moment, then it started crying again, softer now, the sound barely carried in the afternoon air. She'd done this work for 11 years. She had seen things that stayed with her, animals in states of fear so deep they couldn't register kindness, animals that had simply given up. She had never seen anything like this, a wild animal that had every reason to run, choosing not to, not because it was cornered, not because it couldn't escape, but because of this small, pale, crying thing beneath it that was not its own. She looked at the kitten for a long moment. Then she looked at the manual. The manual looked back. Neither of them moved. She leaned toward the colleague beside her, quietly so the words barely carried, and said the thing none of them had thought to say out loud yet. "That's not her baby." And the moment the words landed, Everyone understood that whatever they thought they were looking at, they had only just begun to understand what was actually happening here. Nobody said anything for a while after that. The words had settled over the group like dust. Simple words, obvious, even. Anyone looking at the two animals could see it, but something about saying it out loud changed the weight of the moment, because if it wasn't her baby, and it clearly wasn't, then none of what they were seeing made any sense at all. Wild animals don't protect strangers. That's not sentiment, that's biology. In the animal world, resources are limited, danger is constant, and every action carries a cost. Protecting something that shares none of your genetics, something that gives you nothing in return, it simply doesn't happen, not like this. Not with this kind of calm, deliberate, sustained commitment. The manual had been here before they arrived. Nobody knew how long, and it was still here now. They needed to make a decision. The kitten's condition wasn't improving. If anything, watching it over the last few minutes, it was getting quieter in a way that wasn't reassuring. The small cries had become infrequent. Its breathing looked shallow. It needed warmth, fluid, examination, none of which could happen out here on dry ground in the afternoon wind. The lead rescuer signaled to the others. They would approach slowly, from the front, and give the manual every chance to step aside on its own. It did not step aside. As the first rescuer moved in, crouched low, moving the way you move around a wild animal that hasn't decided what it's going to do yet, the manual dropped its weight even further, front legs wide, head down, ears fully back. It made a sound, low and rough, somewhere in the chest. Not the hiss of a cornered cat, more controlled than that, more deliberate, but it didn't move. The kitten cried again beneath it, and the manulo, without looking away, pressed one paw gently across the kitten's back. Still there, still holding. They tried a second approach from a slightly different angle. Same result. The manulo shifted its body each time, always keeping itself between the rescuers and the kitten, always recalibrating, always watching. It was exhausting to observe. Not because it was violent, but because of what it communicated. This animal was making choices, continuous, active, considered choices, and every single one of them pointed in the same direction. Stay, block, keep the small thing close. One of the team members pulled up what he could on his phone. Pallas's cat behavior, documented cases, interactions with other species, nothing like this. Manuals are among the most solitary of all wild cats. They don't form social groups. They don't share territory peacefully. There is no record anywhere of a wild manual adopting or protecting an animal from a completely different species, and yet the evidence was right in front of them, making a low warning sound in its throat whenever anyone stepped too close. How long had it been here? The person who called it in had spotted them from the road, had pulled over because the manual in daylight was unusual enough to stop for, had noticed the small pale shape underneath, but he hadn't seen how they got there, hadn't seen them arrive. For all anyone knew, this had been going on for hours. Out here, alone, with no one watching, it took nearly 40 minutes. 40 minutes of slow movement, of patience, of the team working in quiet coordinations. One person drawing the manual's attention while another moved carefully from the other side. Not to trick it, just to create enough space to reach the kitten without frightening the manual into a reaction that could hurt them both. When the lead rescuer's hand finally closed around the kitten, gently, firmly, lifting it from the ground, the manual lunged forward 2 steps, not to attack, to follow. She lifted the kitten to her chest and turned her body sideways, giving the manual a clear view, letting it see that it was still there, still breathing. The manual stopped. It stood about 5 feet away, upright now, watching her hold the kitten. Then it looked at the carrier, then back at the kitten. It didn't look away. They had the kitten. They could leave now. The manual had every reason to disappear into the hillside the moment the pressure was off, every biological signal telling it the threat was gone. It did not disappear. As the team made their way back toward the truck, she glanced back once. The manual was following them, not close, not aggressive, but moving parallel through the scrub, keeping pace, watching the kitten with each step. She stopped walking. The manual stopped too. She looked at it for a moment. It looked back. Then she kept walking, and it kept following, and nobody said a word the rest of the way to the truck. They made the call to take both animals in. The manual resisted the trap at first, paced the edges, tested every corner, but it never tried to run in the opposite direction. Every move it made was toward the carrier where the kitten was. Always toward, never away. Once secured, they were loaded separately. The drive back was quiet. From inside the manual's crate came a low, persistent sound. Not distress exactly. More like someone calling into an empty room, waiting to hear if anyone answers. From the kitten's carrier, nothing. Just the faint, shallow rhythm of something trying very hard to keep breathing. At the facility, the moment the kitten disappeared behind a closed door, the manual's behavior shifted completely. The pacing started immediately. Back and forth, low and tight. The vocalization changed too. Higher now, shorter intervals, with pauses where it would go completely still, head up, ears forward, listening, searching in the only way it could. The vet tech who was monitoring it wrote down, significant separation, distress, ongoing. Then she paused, pen still on the paper, and stared at what she'd written. She didn't know what to do with that. None of them did. The lead vet came through the examination room door about 20 minutes after the kitten was brought in. She stood in the doorway for a moment with the kind of expression that belongs to people who have just seen something they need a second to process. Then she looked at the rescuer in the hallway and said quietly, "You need to come see this." And the way she said it, not alarmed, not clinical, just still, meant that whatever was on the other side of that door, it wasn't something any of them had been prepared to find. The examination room was small and very quiet. White walls, a single overhead light. The kind of room where everything unnecessary gets stripped away and what's left is just the thing in front of you and the truth of it. The kitten was on the table, a soft towel underneath it, still warm from the cabinet. An IV line had been started, the needle so small it was almost invisible. The numbers on the monitor were not good. The lead vet didn't look at the monitor when the rescuer came in. She looked at her, then she looked back at the kitten and said, very quietly, like she was still working it out herself, "I want to show you something." She walked her through it carefully. The kitten was severely dehydrated, the kind of dehydration that comes from exposure over time, not hours but closer to a day, possibly longer. Its core temperature was low. There were old injuries too, a partially healed scratch along the left shoulder, a patch of fur missing near the base of the tail, the kind of mark that suggests something had grabbed it and it had gotten away, or been dropped. This kitten had not wandered out into the hills on its own. Something had put it there, or something had chased it there, or both. Either way, it had been alone and suffering for longer than anyone wanted to think about. The vet pulled up the intake notes, read through them once more. Then she set them down. Another 2 hours, she said. Maybe less. That was the window. The honest, clinical estimate of how much time had been left if no one had come. The dehydration alone would have finished it. Add the exposure, the stress, the earlier injuries, and 2 hours was generous. Could have been 1. The rescuer stood with that for a moment. 2 hours. They had been called out at noon. They were on site within 20 minutes. The manual had been there when they arrived, settled, positioned, committed, not freshly arrived, not passing through, which meant the manual had been out there before noon, before the call came in, before anyone knew there was anything to find. It had been watching over something that wasn't its own, for long enough that it made the difference. They sat with the reconstruction of it slowly. The manual hadn't captured the kitten. There were no injury marks consistent with predation. The old wounds predated any contact with the manual by at least a day. It hadn't been carrying it somewhere. It hadn't cornered it. It had simply found it. A small pale thing lying in the dirt, too weak to move, crying into the empty air. And for reasons that no field manual could fully account for, it had stayed. What staying meant, practically. Its body warmth pressed close had slowed the kitten's temperature drop. Its presence in open ground had deterred other predators from approaching. The physical contact had reduced the kitten's stress response and slowed its deterioration, and its vocalizations when the rescuers arrived had made the scene visible and urgent enough to stop for. Without any of it, the kitten would not have been found in time. The manual had not known any of this. It hadn't calculated anything. It had just stayed, and staying had been everything. The vet had been in this work for a long time, long enough to have learned the discipline of not projecting, not reading human meaning into animal behavior, not turning instinct into intention. She still believed all of that. And then she turned and looked through the small window in the door. toward the hallway where the manual's crate sat, and she watched it pace the same 4 steps back and forth, pausing every few passes to press its nose to the wire and go completely still, listening, and then pace again. And she said the thing she said, not for effect, not because she'd decided to set the science aside, just because it was the most accurate description of what the evidence showed. She was keeping it alive. Nobody responded right away. The monitor beeped. The IV drip ticked. Somewhere down the hall, the manual made its low searching sound, paused, and made it again. The rescuer looked at the kitten, at its chest rising and falling in the slow, careful rhythm of something that was still here but had come very close to not being, and she felt something she couldn't have named precisely. Not sadness, not joy, something that sits between the two, in the place where you go when the world shows you something you weren't expecting and you don't have the right word for it yet. She thought about the manual out there on that open ground, the hours it must have spent, the exposure, the daylight, which every instinct it had would have told it was dangerous. None of it had moved it, not a single thing. There were people, she had known a few of them, who would not have stayed that long, who would have found reasons to go. The manual had not done that. She didn't know what to do with that. She just stood there and held it. The immediate crisis was being managed. But the question pressing on everyone in that small white room was simpler and harder than logistics. It was the question that had been sitting underneath everything since the hillside, sharpened now into something almost unbearably clear. What do you do with an animal that chose to stay? What do you owe it? And what happens, to both of them, when the time comes to let go? The vet tech appeared in the doorway. It stopped pacing, she said. Everyone looked at her. Just now. It stopped and it's just sitting there, facing the wall. The vet moved past her into the hallway without a word, because she knew, they all knew, that when an animal that has been searching suddenly goes still and turns inward like that, it usually means one of two things. It has accepted something, or it has given up trying. And right now, in that hallway, they didn't yet know which one this was. It had accepted something. That was the answer when the vet reached the hallway and crouched down in front of the crate. The manual was sitting perfectly still, facing the wall, but its breathing was slow. Its eyes were half closed. Its ears, which had been pressed flat for most of the last 2 hours, were resting in a neutral position, not alert, not searching. It had simply, somewhere in the last few minutes, decided to rest. It wasn't giving up. It was waiting. And somehow, that was the hardest thing to look at of all. The first night was the one that mattered most. They kept the kitten under close monitoring. Fluids running, temperature checked every 2 hours, the soft red glow of the heat lamp the only light in the room after midnight. By 3 in the morning the numbers had steadied, not good yet, but steady, and steady at that point was everything. The second day the kitten took fluid on its own for the first time, a few hesitant laps from a shallow dish. The team noted it without making a fuss, the way experienced people acknowledge good news, quietly, carefully, so as not to count anything before it's earned. But there were small smiles in the hallway, there were. The third day it cried, a real cry, not the thin, failing sound from the hillside, but something with actual complaint in it, hungry, demanding, the sound of something that has decided it intends to keep being alive and would like someone to do something about that immediately. Down the hall, in a separate room, the manual's ears came forward. It stood up from where it had been resting, and it turned toward the sound. The manual's recovery was a different kind of work. Physically it was fine. The exam had shown nothing concerning. A healthy wild animal in good condition, which in one sense simplified things. In another it made everything more complicated. A healthy wild animal doesn't belong in a facility. It belongs in the landscape it came from. That was the principle, and it was a sound one. But the manual wasn't behaving like a wild animal that wanted to go home. It refused food the first day. The second day it ate a little, still restless, still orienting whenever the facility got quiet toward the part of the building where the kitten was. On the third day, the day the kitten cried its first real cry, something in the manual shifted. It ate a full meal that evening. It groomed itself afterward, slowly, methodically. It slept through most of the night without pacing. The vet tech who'd been keeping notes wrote, "Calmer today, unclear why." Everyone else thought they understood why. No one wrote it down. The decision to reintroduce them was not made lightly. There were real questions. The manual was a predator. The kitten was small and still fragile, but the behavioral evidence had been consistent for 3 days, and the kitten, which could not have known anything about what the manual was, had been heard making sounds in the direction of the manual's room that suggested it knew something was there. They decided to try, carefully, with the ability to intervene immediately if anything changed. Nothing changed. They brought the kitten's carrier into the manual's room, set it on the floor, opened the door, and stepped back. The manual was on the far side of the room. It looked up, it looked at the carrier, it looked at the people by the door. Then it got up, slowly, and crossed the room. It stopped about a foot from the carrier and lowered its head. The kitten, who had lifted its head at the sound of movement, went still. For a moment, nothing happened. Just two animals looking at each other across a foot of air, in a quiet room, with several humans holding their breath near the door. Then the manual took the last step forward, and pressed its nose, gently, to the top of the kitten's head. The kitten closed its eyes. The manual stayed there. Nobody in that room moved for a long time. The kitten improved steadily after that. Day by day it looked less like something clinging to the edge and more like something that had decided the edge wasn't where it lived anymore. The manual settled too. The restlessness faded. It began to engage with its environment the way healthy wild cats do, alert, curious, quietly sovereign. It still slept near the kitten when they shared the room. It still occasionally made that low checking sound when the kitten was out of sight, but it was no longer searching. It had found what it was looking for, and it seemed to know that it was safe. When the time came, they prepared carefully. The manual would go back to its territory. That was always the plan, and it remained the right one. It was a wild animal. It belonged to the hillsides and the dry scrub and the long silence between things. Keeping it would have been the wrong kind of kindness, the kind that takes away more than it gives. The kitten would go to a foster home first, then eventually to adoption. Different futures, the right futures, for both of them. Everyone understood this. It was still hard. On the morning of the manual's release, the lead rescuer asked to spend a few minutes with it before the transport crate was loaded. She sat on the floor outside the enclosure. The manual was on the other side of the wire, resting, watching, being quietly and completely itself. She didn't say anything to it. That would have been silly, and she was not a silly person. She just sat with it for a while, the way you sit with something when you want to remember it exactly as it is. The manual looked at her once, then it looked away. That was enough. They drove back to the same hills, same dry scrub, same wide sky. When they opened the crate, the manual walked out without hesitating. No backward glance, no pause at the threshold, just 4 or 5 steps onto the open ground, and then it stopped and lifted its head and breathed in the air of the place it came from. For a moment it was just standing there in the morning light, completely still. Then the grass moved, and it was gone. The lead rescuer stood at the edge of the road for a while after that, looking at the place where it had been. The wind moved through the scrub the same way it had on the day they first drove out here, slow and steady, like it had nowhere particular to be. She thought about the kitten back at the facility, eating on its own now, getting stronger. She thought about the manual out there in the hills, already invisible again, already exactly what it was always supposed to be. She thought about that first moment, the open ground, the two of them together, the small crying thing and the wild animal that had no reason in the world to stay, and stayed anyway. She didn't have a word for it. She'd thought about it enough by now to know she probably never would. Some things sit just outside the reach of language. You can circle them, describe what they look like from the outside, try to account for the facts, but the thing itself, the center of it, stays quiet, stays its own. She got back in the truck. The hills rolled past the window on the drive home, gold and dry in the morning light. Somewhere out there, in the rocks and the silence, a small, dense cat was moving through the landscape it belonged to, alive, whole, free, and in a warm room back at the facility, a pale kitten was sleeping in a patch of sunlight, breathing slowly, growing stronger, both of them going on. And in that quiet, in the space between two lives moving forward in different directions, we realized something none of us had come out here expecting to find. Sometimes survival isn't just biology. Sometimes it isn't just instinct. Sometimes it's something that looks, from the outside, almost exactly like a choice. And whether or not that's the right word for it, whether science has a better one, the result is the same. Something lived that would not have lived, because something stayed that had every reason to go. Make of that what you will. We're still making of it what we can.